I never thought saying yes to a simple favor would change the way I saw myself, but life has a way of testing us when we least expect it. My marriage had been steady for years, built on routine more than passion, comfort more than excitement. My husband and I lived like quiet roommates, each buried in our own obligations. He had his career, his endless phone calls, his late nights spent staring at screens that no longer had room for me. I had learned not to expect much anymore, though some part of me still longed to feel noticed, desired, alive. It was on a Thursday afternoon that my best friend called, her voice hurried. She needed a favor. She was traveling for work and asked if her son could stay at my house for the weekend. I almost laughed when I heard his name. I remembered him as a boy, running around in messy clothes, clumsy and loud. The image of him as a child was the only one I carried, and with that in mind, I said yes without hesitation. It felt harmless. But the knock on my door 2 days later proved how wrong I was. He wasn't the boy I remembered. He was taller than my husband, broad-shouldered, with the careless confidence of youth that hadn't yet learned to doubt itself. His eyes met mine with a steadiness I hadn't expected, and his smile carried a warmth that caught me off guard. For a moment, I struggled to reconcile the boy I once knew with the man standing in front of me. I welcomed him in, trying to push away the strange flutter in my chest. I reminded myself that he was just my friend's son, here for a couple of nights, nothing more. But as the hours passed, I couldn't ignore the contrast between him and the man I shared my bed with. Where my husband barely noticed my presence, he noticed everything. How I wore my hair, the color of my dress, the way I laughed at a small joke. The kind of attention I hadn't felt in years came pouring from him without effort, and I hated how much I liked it. At dinner, my husband barely looked up from his phone. Our guest asked me questions instead, about my work, my hobbies, things I didn't even think anyone cared about anymore. He listened, genuinely, leaning forward as though every word mattered. I found myself speaking more than I should have, my voice softening in a way it hadn't in years. Later, when my husband excused himself to take a call upstairs, I caught myself watching my guest across the room. He had the same habit as his mother, tilting his head slightly when curious, a trait I found both familiar and unsettling. The silence between us wasn't awkward, it was charged, heavy with something unspoken. I turned away quickly, ashamed of where my mind had wandered. That night, as I lay in bed beside my husband's silent figure, I thought about the boy who wasn't a boy anymore. It wasn't supposed to matter, but it did. I closed my eyes and told myself it was nothing, just a strange awareness that would pass. But deep down, I knew the weekend had only begun, and already, I felt myself slipping into something I couldn't name. The next morning began with an unusual lightness, the kind of quiet where every sound feels louder than it should. I came downstairs to find him already in the kitchen, making coffee like he belonged there. His ease unsettled me, though I tried not to show it. He greeted me with a warmth I hadn't felt in a long time, and I couldn't help but notice the faint smile that lingered on his lips as though he had been waiting for me to appear. We slipped into conversation as though no age gap, no unspoken rules, stood between us. He spoke with an honesty I rarely heard from men older than him, let alone from someone my husband still considered a child. His stories were filled with energy, his laughter quick, unrestrained. I realized, with a pang of guilt, that I was enjoying myself too much. The day unfolded with a series of small, almost innocent moments. He followed me into the garden, helping trim the plants, handing me tools, his fingers brushing against mine more than once. Each time it happened, I felt a jolt I tried to ignore. When I asked him to bring down something from a high shelf in the living room, he leaned close, the faint scent of his cologne pulling me into an awareness I hadn't wanted. Our eyes met for only a second, but in that second I felt the air change. At lunch, he complimented my cooking in a way my husband hadn't in years. I laughed it off, saying I had simply followed an old recipe, but the way he looked at me made it feel like more. My cheeks warmed as I cleared the table, my mind wandering to places it had no right to go. The hours passed, and the closeness between us grew harder to ignore. He was respectful, careful not to overstep, but I could feel the unspoken pull. When we sat down to watch a movie later, he chose a spot beside me rather than across the room. I told myself it was nothing, that the couch was big enough, But when his arm brushed mine, I felt it far more deeply than I should have. We laughed at something on screen, and in that shared moment, our shoulders touched. Neither of us moved away. I could feel the heat of his skin through the thin fabric of my sleeve, and it made my heart pound in a way that both thrilled and terrified me. I pretended to adjust my hair, buying time, as though that would somehow erase the weight of what lingered between us. Later that evening, after my husband had gone to bed early with yet another headache, I found him sitting alone at the dining table, scrolling through his phone. I told him good night, expecting nothing more, but he looked up and held my gaze a moment longer than was necessary. There was no word, no touch, only the silence of something hovering just at the edge of happening. As I climbed the stairs, I felt his eyes on me, and I couldn't decide whether I wanted to escape that feeling or hold on to it. My pulse raced as I shut the bedroom door, my husband snoring quietly already. I pressed my back against the wood, breathing too fast, asking myself what I was doing, why my thoughts wouldn't settle. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound in the house seemed amplified: the creak of the floorboards, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the faint rustle from downstairs. My mind replayed every glance, every word, every accidental touch. The distance between what was right and what I wanted felt smaller than ever. And as much as I told myself to stop, I knew something inside me had already crossed a line. The next day carried a heaviness I couldn't shake. I tried to busy myself with chores, telling myself that routine would clear my thoughts, but routine was exactly what had left me numb for so long. My husband left early, his mind already buried in meetings and deadlines, leaving me alone in a house that suddenly felt too alive with the presence of someone I wasn't supposed to notice. I found him in the living room, reading quietly. The morning light cut across his face, and for the first time I understood how easily youth can disguise itself as something older, wiser. When he looked up, our eyes locked, and it was as though every unspoken word from the day before had followed us into this moment. I should have turned away, should have walked out, but instead I stepped closer, asking him something meaningless just to prolong the exchange. He smiled, setting his book aside, and for a second the silence between us felt heavier than any conversation could. My chest tightened as though I were standing on the edge of a cliff, and one step forward would mean no way back. I told myself it was madness, that it could ruin everything, yet still, I lingered. It was the smallest thing that undid me, a hand brushing against mine as he handed me a glass of water. The warmth of his skin stayed on me long after, igniting something I had tried to bury. My breath caught, and when I finally looked at him, I saw the same hesitation in his expression, the same pull neither of us dared name. I tried to speak, to remind him and myself that this couldn't happen, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I felt his fingers graze mine again, deliberate this time. The world seemed to blur in that instant. The rules, the guilt, the reality of who he was and who I was, everything faded under the weight of wanting. When his lips met mine, it was both wrong and inevitable. 1,000 alarms went off in my head, but none of them mattered against the rush of feeling seen, desired, alive again. For a moment I let myself forget the years of indifference, the cold nights beside a husband who no longer noticed me. All that existed was the closeness, the urgency, the forbidden fire that I had thought was long dead within me. When it ended, when reality returned, I pulled back quickly, my heart racing with both exhilaration and shame. I told him it was a mistake, that we couldn't let it happen again. But my words carried no conviction, not with the way my body trembled, not with the way my eyes betrayed me. He didn't argue, didn't press, only nodded with a seriousness beyond his years. Yet in that silence, I knew the truth. We had already crossed the point of no return. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Every glance carried a memory of what had happened, every accidental touch a reminder of what we'd done. I told myself it would stay hidden, that no one would ever know, but guilt pressed down heavier with each passing hour. Still, beneath that guilt was a dangerous thrill, one that whispered quietly to me. For once, I felt alive. By Sunday morning, the house felt different. What had happened lingered in the air, invisible yet impossible to ignore. I moved through the kitchen preparing breakfast with hands that trembled slightly, every sound of a pan or plate too sharp in the silence. He joined me, offering help like nothing had changed, but the way his eyes lingered told me everything had. We spoke little, careful with our words, careful with the spaces between them. I found myself glancing at the clock more than usual, counting down the hours until his mother would arrive, until this fragile world we had stepped into would collapse under the weight of reality. I told myself I should feel relieved, but instead I felt torn. When my husband finally returned home, he barely noticed anything was different. He asked how the weekend had gone, kissed my cheek absent-mindedly, and disappeared into his office without waiting for an answer. I should have been grateful for his blindness, but the indifference only stung sharper now. After what had happened, his absence no longer felt like neglect, it felt like the reason I had let myself slip. The hardest moment came when his mother arrived. She stepped through the doorway with a smile, thanking me for helping, trusting me without hesitation. Her son carried his bag to the car, his movements calm, controlled, but when he turned back for a brief moment, our eyes met. It was fleeting, but in that look was everything. The memory of what we had done, the unspoken promise to never speak of it, the dangerous bond we had formed in silence. I stood at the door long after they drove away, the sound of the car fading into the distance while my heart remained restless. The house felt emptier than before, yet heavier with the secret I now carried. I touched the edge of the doorframe, steadying myself, as the reality of what I had done sank in deeper. That night, lying beside my husband, I stared at the ceiling, wide awake. The memory of what had happened replayed in my mind, every detail sharp and unrelenting. I wanted to tell myself it was just a mistake, a lapse in judgment that would fade with time, but something inside me knew better. It wasn't only about what happened with him, it was about the hollow space in my marriage, the years of being unseen, the loneliness I had quietly endured. Yet none of that justified the choice I made. The guilt pressed down harder with each breath, a reminder that secrets may stay hidden, but they never truly disappear. I wondered if my friend would notice a change in me, if my husband would one day sense the distance I now felt inside. Or perhaps no one would ever know, and the weight of it would remain mine alone. As the house fell into silence, I realized there would be no confession, no revelation. This secret was mine to keep, and with it came a truth I couldn't escape. What I had done could never be undone. I closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. All I could hear was the echo of my own thoughts, whispering over and over again. He had left, but the memory, the guilt, the hunger for something I shouldn't have touched, that would stay with me forever.